The phone is still warm in her hand when the screen goes dark, and Faye Underwood does not yet understand that everything is already gone. She sets the phone down on the kitchen table the way she sets down anything fragile, with both hands, as if it might shatter against the wood. The man on the call had been so patient. He had a kind, tired voice, the voice of a son explaining something to a mother, and he had stayed on the line the whole time, walking her through each step, telling her she was doing fine, telling her the bank's security team only needed a few minutes to move her money somewhere safe before the criminals could reach it. 11 minutes. That was how long the call had lasted. She knows because the old kitchen clock with the cracked face had said 3 minutes past 2 when it began, and 14 past when the line went quiet. 41 years of a Navy pension, a survivor's benefit, and the small, careful savings of 2 people who never once spent money they did not have. All of it had been sitting in one account at the harbor branch of the credit union, and now, the patient voice had assured her, it was safe. It was not safe. By the time the snow started falling over the town of Quillhaven that afternoon, the account held $11 and a fraud. No machine in the building had flagged in time. If a story about loyalty that outlives the grave stays with you, stay until the end, because what one phone call took apart, a dozen quiet men spent the winter putting back together. Quillhaven sat at the cold end of an Oregon inlet, where the fishing fleet had shrunk to 9 boats, and the cannery had been closed so long the gulls had stopped expecting anything from it. In winter, the town went gray from the water up, gray pilings, gray rooftops, gray light that never quite became day. Faye had lived in the same blue house above the harbor for 38 years, and from her front window she could watch the boats come in, though fewer came in every year. And the men who climbed off them were older than they used to be. Her husband had been one of them once. Before that he had been something else, something he rarely spoke about, and the not speaking had been its own kind of language she had learned to read over 4 decades of marriage. Travis Underwood had served 22 years in the Marine Corps before the sea pulled him home, and the men he served with had been more to him than friends. He had told her that once, late, after a bad night when the dreams came, he said a man could love the people who carried him out of the worst day of his life in a way that did not have a name in ordinary language. She had held his hand in the dark and understood that she was married to 2 men, the fisherman, who smelled of diesel and salt, and the Marine who still woke at 4 in the morning to check that the doors were locked. Travis had been gone 3 years now. A quiet heart, the doctor said simply, stopping on an ordinary Tuesday while he mended a net on the back porch. Faye had found him there with the twine still looped around 2 fingers. She had not screamed. She had sat down beside him on the cold boards and held his other hand until the ambulance came, and she had thought, with a clarity that frightened her, that she did not know how to be a person who was not waiting for him to come home. The money had been the last thing keeping the house steady. Without Travis, there to fix the engines of other men's boats for cash, the pension was nearly all she had. She paid her bills from it. She bought her medicine from it. She had been planning, quietly, to use a little of it to fix the furnace that had begun to knock and wheeze, because a woman of 74 should not spend a coastal winter wearing 2 coats inside her own house. So when the phone rang that afternoon and a young man told her there had been suspicious activity on her account, she had felt fear before she felt suspicion, and the fear had done exactly what fear is built to do. It had made her obedient. She did not tell anyone for 2 days. Shame is a quiet animal, and it kept her quiet. She went to the credit union on the 3rd morning, only because the automatic withdrawal for her medication had been declined, and she stood at the counter in her good coat and asked the young teller to please check her balance, certain there had been a mistake. There had been no mistake. The teller's face changed as she looked at the screen, and then she went to get the branch manager. And the branch manager took Fay into a small room with a box of tissues already on the table, which told Fay more than any of the gentle words that followed. $11. The manager explained about wire transfers and authorization and the cruel fine print of a transaction the customer had approved herself. He used the word "unfortunately" several times. He told her the bank would file a report. He did not tell her she would get her money back, because he was an honest man in a hard job, and he knew she would not. Fay walked home along the harbor road in a wind that came straight off the water, and she did not cry because crying felt like a luxury that belonged to people who still had something left to lose. She let herself into the cold blue house, sat down at the kitchen table where the phone had been warm in her hand 3 days before, and she stayed there as the light went out of the afternoon. She did not know that 200 miles inland, in a town she had never seen, a man named after no one important was about to receive a letter that would change the shape of her winter. The letter came to a small house at the edge of a high desert town where the snow was dry and squeaked underfoot, and the mountains stood blue and enormous against the eastern sky. Gunnery Sergeant Wade Calloway, retired, had been splitting wood in the cold morning when the mail carrier's truck ground up the gravel drive, and he set the axe down and walked over, because Pearl had already trotted out to meet the truck the way she met everything, ears up, tail low, taking the measure of the situation before he could. Wade was 41 years old and built like a man who had carried heavy things for a living, broad through the shoulders and thick through the forearms, with the kind of stillness in him that made other men instinctively quiet down. His hair had gone iron gray at the temples, and he kept it cut close, and there was a pale seam of scar tissue along the right side of his jaw, where a piece of a vehicle had found him on a road far from home. His eyes were a flat gray that rarely settled, the eyes of someone who had spent 2 decades learning that the dangerous thing in a room is usually the thing nobody else is looking at. Pearl was a German shepherd, tan and black, with a dark saddle of fur across her back and a black mask over her muzzle, and she was the only living thing Wade had brought home from his last deployment. She had been a working dog once, trained to find the things men buried to kill other men, and she had retired the same year he had, the two of them mustering out together like a pair of old soldiers who had agreed not to leave the other behind. She was lean and strong, with tall ears that stood straight up and a long bushy tail, and a small white scar on her left foreleg where she had once pushed through wire to reach him. She wore a plain brown leather collar, worn soft with age. She did not need a vest anymore. She had not stopped working. She had only changed what she was working on, and now the thing she watched over was the man splitting wood in the cold. The envelope was thin, and the handwriting on the front was unfamiliar, an old woman's careful cursive, and the return address was a town on the coast Wade had never visited. He turned it over twice before he opened it, the way he had been trained to treat anything that arrived without warning. Then he leaned the axe against the chopping block, sat down on the cold porch step with Pearl pressing warm against his leg, and read it. It was from Fay Underwood. She wrote that she was the widow of Travis Underwood and that she had found Wade's name and address among her husband's papers, written in his own hand on the back of an old photograph with the words, "My brothers," underneath a list of names. She wrote that she was sorry to bother a stranger. She wrote that she did not know who else might have known her husband, because Travis had outlived most of the men he served with, and the few who remained had scattered to the far edges of the country the way old Marines do. She did not ask for anything. That was the part that stayed with Wade longer than he expected. She had written to a man she had never met, simply to tell him that someone he might have loved was gone 3 years now, and that there had been no one at the grave who wore the uniform he had worn. She had thought, she wrote, that Travis would have wanted his brothers to know. At the bottom, almost as an afterthought, in smaller and shakier writing, she had added one line. She wrote that she was managing mostly, though it had been a hard month, and that she was sorry again for troubling him. Wade read the letter twice. Well, then he sat for a long time with his hand on Pearl's broad head, looking at the mountains without seeing them. The name Underwood meant nothing to him directly. Travis had served and gone home before Wade had ever pinned on a single chevron. Yet the photograph she described, the roster of names with my brothers written beneath it, that was a thing Wade understood in his bones. He had a photograph like it himself in a drawer he did not open often, and on the back of his were names, too. And some of them were names of men who were no longer alive to answer a letter. Something in those few sentences would not leave him alone. For the rest of the day, a hard month, she had written, and then apologized for it, as if grief were a discourtesy. He had known a great many people who learned to apologize for their own pain. Most of them had earned the right to do the opposite. He found Travis Underwood's name in an old roster the next morning, in a footlocker of papers he kept, because throwing them away had always felt like a small betrayal. Travis was not on any list Wade had served on. Still, 2 of the names beneath the photograph in Faye's letter were names Wade did know, because they belonged to a network of men who had spent 30 years keeping track of one another across a country that mostly forgot they existed. A phone tree, a directory that lived in nobody's computer and everybody's memory. The men of a single battalion, and the men they had adopted into it, scattered now, but never fully apart. Wade made one call that morning to a man named Royce Tibbett in Arizona who had lost a leg in the same country Wade had lost the smoothness of his jaw. Royce had been a radio operator once and was now improbably a forensic accountant, the kind of second life that no one back then would have predicted for a kid who could barely sit still. Wade read in the letter over the phone, all of it, including the line at the bottom. Royce was quiet for a moment after Wade finished. Then he asked one question. He asked what a hard month meant, exactly, for a 74-year-old widow on a fixed income. And Wade realized he did not know, and that he should find out, and that he was not going to be able to put the letter back in the drawer. He called the credit union in Quillhaven the next day, not as anyone official, just as a man asking after a woman who had written to him. The branch manager would tell him nothing, which was correct of the manager. The manager did, however, say one thing carefully, in the way of a man leaving a door open without walking through it himself. He said that if Wade was a friend of the family might want to talk to him soon, because Mrs. Aka, Underwood had had some trouble, and the kind of trouble it was, tended to get worse before it got better, and there were not enough people in the world watching out for women like her. Wade hung up the phone. He stood in his kitchen for a while. Then he went and got the gear bag from the closet, the one that had stayed packed for 20 years out of a habit he had never managed to break, and he put it by the door. Pearl watched him do it, and then she went and lay down across the threshold, her chin on her paws, her eyes on him. She did not put herself between Wade and the door for nothing. He trusted that more than he trusted his own restlessness. They drove west the following morning, the dog in the passenger seat with her nose to the gap in the window, the mountains falling away behind them, and the land going green and then gray as the coast came up. It was a full day's drive, and Wade made 2 stops along the way, both of them to meet men he had not seen in years. By the time he reached the cold end of the inlet where Quillhaven sat, 3 other men knew where he was going and why, and one of them, Royce, had already begun pulling on a thread that Faye Underwood did not know existed. The blue house at the cold end of the inlet looked smaller than the wind that surrounded it. Wade parked on the road and sat for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled, and then he got out, and Pearl came down out of the truck and stood close against his left leg, her ears swinging toward the house, reading it. He knocked softly. He had learned a long time ago that a hard knock frightens people who are already afraid. The woman who opened the door was small and straight-backed in a gray cardigan, with white hair pinned up and a face that had been pretty once and was now simply tired in a dignified way. She looked at the big man on her porch, and then she looked down at the dog, and something moved across her face that Wade would think about later for a long time. She had been braced for more bad news. She had not been braced for a German shepherd looking up at her with patient brown eyes. He told her his name. He told her she had written to him. He watched her hand come up and cover her mouth, and he saw her remember in real time that she had sent that letter weeks ago into the dark, never expecting the dark to send anything back. She made coffee because her hands needed something to do. Wade sat at the kitchen table with the cracked clock on the wall, and Pearl lay down on the cold linoleum at Faye's feet, not his, which surprised him, and she rested her chin on the old woman's slipper and let out a long breath. Faye looked down at the dog, and her composure, which had held through the bank and the silence and the shame, finally cracked, just slightly at the corner. Wade did not rush her. He let the coffee cool. He looked at the photographs on the wall, a young Travis in dress blues, an older Travis on the deck of a boat, the 2 of them together on a porch. That was probably this one. He let the room tell him things, and when Faye finally began to talk, it came out the way water comes through a crack slowly, and then, all at once, she told him. About the call, the patient young man, the 11 minutes, the $11. She told it flatly, without self-pity, but Wade could see what it had cost her to say the numbers out loud, and he understood that the worst part for her was not the money. The worst part was that she had been the one who pressed the buttons. The shame of having been fooled sat heavier on her than the loss itself. Wade listened without moving. When she finished, he did not tell her it was not her fault, though it was not. He had learned that telling a proud person their pain was not their fault often only made the shame worse. Instead, he asked her a question quietly. He asked her whether she still had the phone the man had called, and the call log on it, and the time the call had come in. She did. She fetched it with both hands the way she handled anything fragile. Wade looked at the number, at the time stamp, at the long string of digits that meant nothing to him and would mean a great deal to a one-legged radio operator in Arizona. He took a photograph of the screen with his own phone. Then he sent it to Royce, with one line beneath it. He wrote, "This is the one I told you about." A tightness gathered low in his chest, one he had not felt in years. Combat had never made him feel quite like this. Watching a careful, honest woman fold her hands and apologize for being robbed felt worse somehow than anything a road in another country had ever done to him. What Royce found over the next several days, he found slowly the way water finds a path through rock. The money had not simply vanished. Money never simply vanishes. It moves, and movement leaves a trail. And a man who had spent his second life learning to read those trails could follow it further than the criminals expected anyone to bother. The 11 minutes had been only the beginning. The patient young man had not been a lone wolf with a cheap phone. He had been one voice in a room full of voices, a call center operating out of a rented office, suite 3 states away, dialing through a stolen list of names and ages and account types, looking for exactly the kind of person Faye had been, a widow, alone, recently bereaved, with a single account holding everything. The money had moved from the credit union into a holding account, and from there it had been broken into pieces and scattered across a half-dozen smaller accounts, and from there it had begun the slow journey toward becoming untraceable. But it had not finished that journey. That was the thing the criminals had counted on, the slowness of everyone who might come after them. Banks were slow, police were overworked, old women were ashamed and silent. By the time any one official got around to looking, the money would be gone past the horizon and the trail would be cold. They were not wrong about how the world usually worked. They had simply not counted on a phone tree of old Marines who had nothing but time and a reason. Royce called Wade on the 4th night. He had traced the money to a man. Not the voice on the phone. The voice was a hired kid in a headset who would never see most of what he stole. The man Royce found sat above all of it. A man who owned the rented office suite through a company that owned another company. A man named Dorsey Hale who lived in a glass house above a golf course and had done this before in other states under other company names, always staying one shell removed from the crime itself. Royce had found 2 earlier operations under different names that had simply dissolved the week investigators got close, leaving the hired voices to take the blame and Hale to open up shop again somewhere new. That was the part that mattered, Royce said. Hale was not careless. Hale was patient and well-lawyered, and he protected himself the way a careful man protects a thing he has built. The money he had taken from Faye was already being moved toward a structure designed to make clawing it back nearly impossible. If they wanted it, they could not wait for the slow machinery of the world. They would have to move faster than Hale expected anyone to move, and they would have to do it the right way, with evidence through the proper channels, so that nothing they did could be undone later by a good lawyer. Wade sat with that for a long time after the call ended. Pearl had come to lie against him in the dark of the rented room near the harbor, and he put his hand on her side and felt her breathe. He was a man who had spent his life solving problems with his body, and this was not a problem his body could solve. There was no door to kick, no road to clear, no enemy he could stand between and the people behind him. The enemy was a man in a glass house with a lawyer, and the only way to reach him ran through paperwork and patience and the slow turning of institutions, the exact things Wade had the least faith in. It would have been easier, some part of him admitted in the dark, to drive to the glass house and stand in the man's doorway and let him understand, without a word, what it meant that Faye Underwood was not alone in the world. Wade had the size for it. He had the stillness for it. He had promised, though, a great many things over the years, to the Corps and to himself and to the men whose names were written on the back of a photograph. And one of the things he had promised was that he would not become the kind of man Dorsey Hale already was, a man who took what he wanted because he was strong enough to take it. So he did not drive to the glass house. He picked up the phone instead, and he began to make calls, and the phone tree began to do what it had been built over 30 years to do. By the end of the week, the network had moved. A man in Sacramento who had spent his post-service life as a fraud investigator for a bank made 3 introductions to people who could freeze accounts faster than a court order. A woman in Boise, the daughter of a Marine who had died in Travis's company, worked in the state attorney general's Consumer Protection Division, and knew exactly which form, filed by exactly which person, would put a legal hold on the scattered accounts before they could empty. Royce assembled the trail into a document so clean and so clearly told that a busy investigator could understand the whole crime in 20 minutes. And Wade did the one thing none of them could do from a distance. He stayed in Quillhaven, in the cold rented room with his dog, close enough to the widow's blue house that she was never again alone. With the silence, the community gathered the way water gathers, finding the low places first. Word moved through a small town faster than any wire. The teller who had first seen the $11 on the screen turned out to be the granddaughter of a man who had crewed with Travis for a decade. And once she understood who Faye was, she became fierce on her behalf, walking the paperwork through her own branch by hand. The harbor master, a leathery man named Esau Pike, who had not spoken more than 20 words to anyone in a year, showed up at Faye's door one morning with a truckload of seasoned wood and spent the day stacking it against her house without being asked, because a man should not let Travis Underwood's widow be cold. He would not take coffee for it. He tipped his cap to Pearl, of all things, and drove away. Faye, who had spent 3 years learning to need no one, found herself surrounded, and it undid her more thoroughly than the robbery had. She kept trying to thank people and kept failing, because every time she opened her mouth, the gratitude came up as tears instead of words. Wade watched her struggle with it and understood it perfectly. He had spent his own life being undone by kindness he did not know how to accept. There was an ache, particular to discovering that someone had quietly cared for the thing you thought you had been left alone to carry. The dog was the bridge for all of it. Pearl had decided, somewhere in those first days, that Faye belonged to her now, the way Wade belonged to her, and she divided her vigilance between the two of them. In the mornings, she walked the harbor road at Faye's slow pace, matching her stride to the old woman's the way she had once matched it to a young Marine's. In the evenings, she lay across the threshold of the blue house, her chin on her paws, and Faye took to talking to her in the low private voice that people save for animals, telling the dog things she had not told a living soul since Travis died. Wade pretended not to hear through the thin wall. And the things he could not help hearing he kept to himself. The first false dawn came 9 days in. Royce called to say the legal hold had landed, that the scattered accounts had been frozen before they could empty, that the money, most of it, was sitting in limbo where Hale could not reach it. For one evening it felt like victory. Wade told Faye carefully, not promising anything, that there was a chance, a real chance, the money could come home. He watched hope move into her face like warmth into a cold room, and he regretted it almost immediately because hope given too early is its own kind of cruelty. Hale moved the next morning. He was not a man who lost things quietly. His lawyer filed a blizzard of objections, claiming the accounts belonged to legitimate businesses, that the holds were improper, that the funds were the property of clients who would be harmed by the freeze. He produced contracts. He produced invoices. He produced, with the speed of a man who had prepared for exactly this, paper trail that made the stolen money look like the ordinary revenue of a consulting firm doing lawful work. He had built in advance a story that explained the money as something other than theft, and he had the documents to back the story, and a tired judge looking at competing paperwork might well believe him. That was Hale's active defense, and it was a good one. He did not deny the money existed. He drowned its true nature in a flood of false legitimacy, betting that no one would have the energy or the evidence to prove which papers were real. The hold began to wobble. The Attorney General's office, looking at the contracts, grew cautious. The window that had opened began slowly to close. The black morning came on the 12th day. Royce called before light, his voice flat with exhaustion, and told Wade that Hale's lawyer had requested an emergency hearing to lift the freeze, that the contracts were good enough to create doubt, and that doubt was all Hale needed. If the freeze lifted, the money would be gone within the hour, moved offshore through channels already prepared, and there would be no getting it back. Worse, Hale's filings had named Faye, suggesting she had knowingly authorized the transfer, hinting that the old woman was a willing participant, trying to claw back money she had freely given. It was a vicious move, and it was a clever one, because the one piece of evidence everyone had was Faye's own recorded authorization on the phone, her own voice saying yes. Wade drove to the Blue House in the dark. He had to tell her, because she would hear it otherwise, and she deserved to hear hard things from someone who was not afraid to sit in the room while she absorbed them. He told her plainly the money might be lost. Worse, the man who took it was trying to make her look like she had given it away on purpose. Faye listened with her hands folded on the table, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. And then she said something that Wade did not expect. She said she had kept everything. She said it the way a person says a thing they are ashamed of. After the robbery and the long silent days before she wrote the letter, she had not been able to throw anything away. She had kept the phone, the call log, the times. She had kept something else, too, something she had not mentioned because she thought it was only the foolishness of a frightened old woman. During the call, frightened and not understanding, she had picked up Travis's old pocket recorder from the drawer by the phone, the small device he had used for 30 years to dictate parts lists and engine notes while his hands were busy, and out of some instinct she could not name, she had pressed record. She had recorded the whole call, the patient voice, the instructions. The moment the man told her in his own words that he was moving her money to keep it safe, and the moment he told her, near the end, the name of the company it was going to, a name he should never have said aloud, Wade sat very still. He asked her if he could hear it. She fetched the recorder with both hands. The voice that came out of the small speaker was exactly as she had described it, patient and warm, and utterly without conscience, and it said, in the middle of its gentle reassurances, the name of the holding company Royce had spent 12 days proving was Dorsey Hales. It said the name in the act of stealing. It was not paperwork. It was not a contract built after the fact to launder a story. It was the crime itself, captured in the criminal's own voice, time-stamped by the call log on the phone beside it. The one thing Hale's blizzard of false documents could not explain away. A man can forge an invoice. He cannot forge the moment of the theft after his own hired voice has already confessed it. Wade looked at the old woman who had apologized twice for troubling him. He thought about how close this had come to being lost forever, saved only because a frightened widow had reached for her dead husband's recorder and pressed a button she did not understand. He did not believe much in luck. He believed in the long habits people build, and Travis Underwood had built, over 30 years. A habit of recording things, and his widow had reached for that habit in the worst minutes of her life, the way you reach for a railing in the dark. The dead man had left her a tool, and her own steadiness had used it. The recording moved fast once Royce had it. It went to the woman in Boise at the Attorney General's office who stopped being cautious the moment she heard the criminal name, the company, in his own voice. It went to the fraud investigator in Sacramento, who matched the timestamp to the wire and closed the last gap in the trail. It went cleaned and authenticated into the emergency hearing that Hale's own lawyer had requested, and it turned that hearing from a chance to lift the freeze into the moment the whole structure came apart. The contracts did not matter anymore. A man's own voice, in the act of the theft, naming his own company, made the false paperwork worthless. You cannot argue that money was lawful revenue when the world can hear it being stolen. Wade was not in the room when it happened, and neither was Fay, because the proper channels do their work in plain offices far from the people they are meant to protect. Royce called the moment, though it was done, and Wade carried the phone to the kitchen table and set it down between himself and the old woman and let her hear it directly, so that the news would not pass through him. The freeze would hold. The money would come home, most of it the long way through the slow, honest machinery that Wade had spent his life mistrusting and now found himself unexpectedly grateful for. And Dorsey Hale, who had stayed one shell removed from his crimes for years, found that there was no shell thick enough to muffle the sound of his own operation, confessing Hale did not go quietly even then. Men like him rarely faced the thing they did. He fought from behind his lawyer for weeks, and in the end he did not stand in any dock and look anyone in the eye. He signed papers. He surrendered the accounts. He paid in money and in the end of his quiet business, and then he vanished the way such men do into a smaller life, in some other state, diminished but not destroyed, because the world does not always finish the job. The operation that had drained an old woman's pension in 11 minutes was finished. The call center went dark. The column of names was no longer being dialed. And the thing Hale had counted on most, the slowness and the silence and the shame of the people he stole from, had been beaten by the one thing he had not accounted for, which was that some people are not as alone as they appear. The money came back to the credit union on a gray afternoon in the last week of winter, and the branch manager who had once handed Fay a box of tissues called her himself to tell her, and his voice was not steady when he did. Fay took the call, standing at her kitchen counter with Pearl pressed against her leg, and when she set the phone down, she did not cry. She had done all her crying weeks before. Instead, she stood very still and looked out the window at the harbor, where the light was just beginning to lengthen towards spring, and she felt, for the first time in 3 years, that she was not waiting for anything. Wade stayed in Quillhaven longer than he had meant to. The high desert town with the blue mountains was still his home, and he would go back to it. But he found that he could not quite leave the cold end of the inlet, while there was wood to be split, and a furnace that still knocked, and an old woman learning, slowly, how to let people help her. He fixed the furnace himself, with parts he ordered, and an afternoon of cursing quietly under the house. And when it finally caught and ran clean, he sat on the kitchen floor, covered in dust, and Fay brought him coffee, and they did not say much, because by then they did not need to. The men of the phone tree never gathered in one place. That was not how they worked. Over the following weeks, though, they reached Fay one at a time, by letter and by phone, men she had never met, who had known her husband or had known someone who knew him. And each of them told her some small thing about Travis she had not heard a night. He had stayed awake with a frightened kid, a debt he had quietly paid, a man he had carried. She wrote it all down in a notebook. She had been married to him for 41 years, and she was still at 74, learning who he had been, and the learning was a gift she had stopped expecting the world to give her. On his last morning in Quillhaven, Wade walked the harbor road one more time with the dog at his side, and the old woman beside him at her slow and steady pace. The fishing boats were going out, 9 of them, into a sea that had gone silver under a sky that was finally letting go of winter. Esau Pike raised a hand from the deck of his boat as they passed, and Fay raised hers back. Pearl trotted ahead and then circled back, ranging and returning the way she had done all her life, never letting the distance between herself and the people she guarded grow too wide. They stopped at the place where the road came nearest the water and stood looking out for a while. Then she said, without turning, that she had written one more letter, and that she hoped Wade would not mind. She had written to a young Marine she had read about, a kid mustering out with a working dog he did not know how he would feed, and she had told him there was a town on the coast where the winters were hard, but the people stacked your wood for you, and the blue house on the harbor road had a porch and a furnace that worked. Now, she said, she did not know if he would come. She said it seemed like the kind of thing Travis would have done, reaching out into the dark for a stranger, and that she had decided she would rather be the kind of person her husband had been than the kind of person fear had tried to make her. Wade looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the dog, who had come back to sit against the old woman's leg, ears up, taking the measure of the morning. He thought about the letter that had found him at the edge of a high desert town, written by a woman who had only meant to tell him a friend was gone, and about how that thin envelope had reached across 200 miles and pulled a dozen scattered men back into the shape of a unit, and about how the thing that had defeated a careful and well-lauded thief in the end had not been force or luck, but the long, patient loyalty of people who refused to let one of their own be alone. He'd told her he thought it was exactly the kind of thing Travis would have done. He told her the young Marine would come sooner or later, because men with nothing to feed a dog tend to go where the wood is already stacked. And he told her that when the kid came, she should call him, because he would want to drive back over the mountains and be there, and Pearl would want to meet the new dog, and there was no reason a thing like this should ever happen in a town only once. They stood together a while longer in the lengthening light, the Marine and the widow and the old working dog, and the boats went out, and the water held the sky, and the cold blue house above the harbor was warm now and waiting with the porch light on. If you have ever believed that the people you have lost take their love with them when they go, let this be the thing you carry from here. Travis Underwood had been gone 3 years, and still, on the worst day of his widow's life, his loyalty reached forward through a list of names on the back of a photograph and gathered a dozen men to stand around her. Love does not end at a graveside. It becomes a debt the living are honored to pay, and it travels further than any of us will ever see. May the people who guard you be patient, and may the kindness you give in the dark find its way home to you when you most need it, and may you never be as alone as you fear. Go gently, and keep your porch light on for the stranger who has nowhere yet to land.